I'm Yang Rui. It has long been debated whether trust or distrust between China and the United States is on the rise. Last year brought about important changes to the Sino-American dynamics. Most notably, the U.S. much heralded pivot to Asia. Now that both countries have completed their respective leadership transition, the two powers can begin redefining their ever-transforming relationship. What will be the major trends in 2013? How do China and America's elite youth view the on and off wrangling in different fields in our bilateral tie? Information deficit leads to trust deficit. President Obama decides to honor his promise to send 100,000 American students to China.
We focused on student exchanges because we believe that the future is very clearly in the hands of the young people.
Is it an attempt to learn more from its strategic competitor? Why does China have far less students from Western countries? Could the sluggish U.S. economy get a lift should Washington amend its 1965 immigration law?
I'm here today because the time has come for common sense, comprehensive immigration reform. The time is now.
And can the structural geopolitical and economic tensions be reduced as young people from both countries learn more about each other through competitions? Today, we are joined here in the Beijing studio by Mr. Cao Can, Juris Doctor from UC Berkeley, Mr. Ryan Morgan, undergraduate from Columbia University, and Mr. Alexander Su, undergraduate from Dartmouth College. Welcome to Dialogue, gentlemen. What do we think of the implications of China's success story, quote unquote?
I think China is very important source of information for the U.S. I think we could learn from China's success. And as I'm a structural engineering major at Columbia, and I've noticed a lot of the infrastructure improvements, and it could definitely be a model for the rest of the world.
Now, when we talk about construction boom, there's yet a quite different story concerning what the success story means about China. The construction boom is actually carried out at the cost of farmers' well-being. For example, their farming land is shrinking rapidly with the conspiracy between local governments and the property developers. Therefore, they are deprived of their rights to develop their own farming land. What do you think of this accusation?
Well, first of all, the farmers also benefit from the construction boom indirectly. It makes the transportation much easier. You know, in the past, for instance, the Guangzhou to Beijing high-speed railway makes it much easier for farmers to become migrant workers because it's easier for them to travel to cities. And this is also part of the urbanization process. The Chinese leadership wants to transform the Chinese economy from a agricultural economy to a industrial economy. They want farmers to move into the top-tier cities and to contribute to the construction boom there. So even though they may lose their jobs as farmers, but they can get more jobs as migrant workers.
At least 1 decade ago, one senior diplomat from a democracy told me, and her remarks did surprise me. She said, Yang Rui, don't learn from the Israeli or Indian democracy because the partisan politics mean they argue, they debate endlessly, on and on, without fixing their agenda, without getting things done as what happened in China. And therefore, I started questioning the virtues of democracy. You can criticize me. You can criticize or balance the views about America being the perfect role model as a super democracy. Now we start from Ryan.
Actually, I don't think the United States is a perfect democracy or a perfect model. As we've seen recently, there's been increased partisan conflict, and it's resulted in some failures to get things done. There's not very much efficiency
but they're
anymore.
pretty bipartisan in spending, right? So their differences are actually minor. There are more similarities between Republicans and Democrats than differences. You know, they all want to grow the government. None of them have the political guts to cut spending. So the differences are actually very minor in terms of their similarities. Do you agree?
I don't really agree that they're that similar. Maybe from someone from the outside or an outside observer, but I think there are a lot of deep conflicts and And we've been seeing that coming to light in the recent days
For instance,
with the
you know,
fiscal
Obama is a Democrat, Bush
Yes.
is a Republican. But do you see a big change in their in terms of the foreign policy, economic policy? I actually see a continuity there.
Right, and I think I have to agree with you regarding foreign policy. I think Ryan and I are a little bit more well versed in what American government does domestically. But as far as foreign policy goes, I think that the regime change is actually quite similar. And there's a little bit, the executive branch is limited in what they can do by structures that are already in place. And the difference in regimes can't always change that immediately.
Well, last year saw major changes in domestic politics, both in France and the US, the leading democracies in the West. But what happened in the presidential race, I'm afraid, has always been that the candidates would promise generously to the voters, I will definitely cut your tax. At the same time, I will absolutely increase your social benefits. And that means sovereignty debt crisis that is sweeping across the Eurozone. And therefore, we ask the question about whether there's a looming crisis in Western capitalism, if not democracy. That's why I ask the question, which is more suitable or acceptable for voters who would lay more emphasis on livelihoods instead of democracy itself?
Right. Well, I mean, what you mentioned before, I'd say that in an election, the political reality is that a politician needs to win over the people. And the rhetoric that inspires people to vote for them is, as you have said, cutting taxes and raising their benefits. But realistically speaking, I think there's very little that Obama can do in the grand scheme of things. And that he can promise a lot of things to the American people, but he's severely restricted in what he can do.
President Obama said during his presidential campaign for the first time that he was ready to cut the fiscal deficit, and what happened 4 years later was another $6 trillion of national debt occurred. So how do you look at his promise or campaign pledge? I mean, why did he get re-elected again?
I think the answer to that is simple. I think that, first of all, the new debt is partially the result of our recovery from the economic crisis of 2008, 2009. But also, I think he was re-elected because people are looking for promises of new jobs, promises of
Right, but
benefit.
The thing is that he actually promised a lot in 2008 when he first got elected, but very little promise has been fulfilled. So I think Yang Rui's question is, why do Americans keep electing someone who can't keep his promise?
Exactly.
Well,
I think his hands are kind of tied by by American Congress and
the killing
the
of Bin
legislative
Laden.
system.
Or the killing of Bin Laden.
I don't think that was I don't think that was necessarily the biggest point in his reelection. Actually, if you were in America, you would realize that that was actually a very, very small issue.
Right. And I'd say that in this particular instance, it was for the American people deciding between the lesser of two evils. I think that the general American sentiment is that they're very, very tired of what the politicians have said. And it's really, I think that things may be a little bit worse had Romney been elected.
Right. Politicians have to be wrestling with different problems, be they domestic or external. Now, when you talk about which is the lesser evil, let's look at the relationship between the U.S. and China.
Right.
Do you think domestic woes, economic ones, are especially the biggest threat for the U.S. people, voters, or China threat?
I think certainly U.S. voters are more concentrated on domestic economic issues. I think in the last election, everybody was focused on jobs numbers. I think one of the things that helped Obama get reelected is that there was a modest improvement in unemployment and in job creation. I think that people, like Alex said, the lesser of two evils, they saw that President Obama was able to at least start to turn the U.S. economy around. And
how did Obama turn the economy around? The amount of debt keep piling up. Right?
I don't think.
And the inflation, the dollar keeps going down.
Let me.
If you look at the price of gasoline and the price of
and
food,
the QE4 in particular.
I mean, so the whole U.S. economy is actually on life support. I would hardly call that economic recovery.
But let's look at this from the perspective of the election itself. And if we were deciding between Obama and Romney, one thing that Romney's campaign was very emphasized on, and one thing that he constantly emphasized in every single political ad was this quote that he was saying about cracking down on cheaters like China. And this is not something that I believe the American people believe in, and that the U.S. foreign policy should go into. For example, we were talking about manufacturing jobs in the United States being shipped off to China, where the costs are much lower, and the realistic assessment of that shift, if Romney really tried to bring jobs that were more efficiently completed in China back to the United States, that is what socialism is. It's for the benefit of the workers rather than for the benefit of the people. And if we're looking at this from the elections perspective, I think that Obama has a better grasp of the foreign policy realities than Romney does.
But do you think outsourcing American jobs, quote unquote, is more of a political rhetoric or data from the perspective of an economist, Ryan?
I definitely think that's it's more rhetoric. I think we spoke with some officials earlier this morning, and one of the things we mentioned is that it's more of a planned economy to bring jobs back, like Mr. Romney proposed. And I think it's not taking the interests of the people or the interests of the market economy into account.
Well, I think Obama pledged the same thing. You know, he talked about bringing manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. But I think the deal breaker between Mitt Romney and President Obama is that Mitt Romney is more has a entrepreneurial background. He talk about shrinking the government. His vice presidential candidate is Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan is actually a reader of Ayn Rand. So they both want to bringing free market capitalism, control the government. But the Americans developed a dependency on government. They want to grow the government. They want to depend on all kinds of entitlements. So this kind of dependency on government brings the a welfare mentality. As Obama sort of catered to that welfare mentality by giving all kinds of promises. That's what gets him elected.
Politicians tend to talk smart about job creation, but entrepreneurs will look the other way around. For example, Steve Jobs would say, he did say to President Obama during the president's trip to the Silicon Valley in California that it's mission impossible to bring jobs back from China to California because of the pretty high labor cost in your country.
Right.
So what do you think of the seed difference between the presidential perspective and an entrepreneur's concerns?
But I think the labor cost cannot explain everything, because labor costs in Japan and Germany are also very high, even higher than the U.S. But Germany and Japan both are great manufacturing countries, both run huge trade surplus, both are creditor nations. Now, so why can't the U.S. do that? So I think labor cost is the one of the many factors. You also have to look at the regulation, the tax system, the economic policies promoted by the government. So there's a variety of reasons.
Cao Tan, your question is very provocative, but it's very useful in enlightening my next question. For example, do you think that there's a current tendency amongst the young Americans, even now the middle-aged, the middle-income class, that instead of pinning your hopes on the real economy, Wall Street is a silver lining for making money quickly overnight, for getting rich or super rich overnight? So fictitious economy starts or threatens to replace the real economy. Therefore, people say, hey, why should I work as hard as the Chinese? I can put my money in the stock exchange market in New York, right?
And that's the sort of like the double-edged sword of the privileged financial position that the United States occupies. It brings a lot of benefits to Americans as the architects of the financial system. They enjoy the exorbitant privilege of the U.S. dollar. And this privilege also brings them negative benefits, because they can just export U.S. dollars and U.S. treasuries for the cheap imports from China, so they don't need to work as hard as the Chinese does.
Gentlemen, part of the job here for bringing you guys here is to remove the glow of an icon. I'll get back to you after the short break. You are watching Dialogue with Alexander, Cao Can, and Ryan. We are talking about what the future might hold for both the US and China. Stay with us.
Information deficit leads to trust deficit. President Obama decides to honor his promise to send 100,000 American students to China.
We focused on student exchanges because we believe that the future is very clearly in the hands of the young people.
Is it an attempt to learn more from its strategic competitor? Why does China have far less students from Western countries? Could the sluggish U.S. economy get a lift should Washington amend its 1965 immigration law?
I'm here today because the time has come for common sense, comprehensive immigration reform. The time is now.
And can the structural geopolitical and economic tensions be reduced as young people from both countries learn more about each other through competitions?
Welcome back. Let's look at the gun control. The killings in Connecticut shocked the whole world. But the National Rifle Association vowed to fight to the end, despite growing concerns about the gun-related violence, particularly the violence that targets kids in your country, in the United States of America. So, are you hopeful that he's going to get the job done?
I kind of have mixed feelings about this. I think that the political reality in the United States is that that there probably won't be any sort of major change. However, there may be some sort of compromise, some sort of very probably quite weak change in regulation. Perhaps maybe bring back an assault weapons ban, but I'm not entirely optimistic about it.
But you know, the problem is that I don't think gun control is effective, because I don't think the U.S. should just ban the use of gun because of this shooting instance. For instance, in China, in the kindergartens, I believe there are several instances where people use knives to kill the small children, smaller kids. So should we just have a ban on use of knives? And there's a lot of automobile accidents in China. People drive automobiles and kill a lot of passengers. Should we pass a law banning the use of automobiles? It's not the gun that kills people, it's the people who kill. The
point of my next question is very much about the role that the lobby groups play in U.S. politics.
Right.
Do you think the National Rifle Association does care about the dignity and the life of the kids, or about their own interests?
Right.
So what do you think of the immediate response from the victim parents of the victims? The next day, most of them would go back to the gun shops and buy more weapons instead of calling for banning the weapons.
I definitely think about the NRA and money in politics. I think that they have a huge lobbying potential, and there was their leader, the NRA leader, came on TV shortly after the shootings, and he didn't seem to truly apologize in any meaningful context. I think that they have their own interests in mind when they go and lobby the U.S. government, and they're very stuck in, they're very set in their ways.
But Cao Can,
yes.
What would the Chinese authorities do should such violent acts occur in our country, China?
Well, I think there's no way to completely prevent crime, because in a society where there are billions of people and billions of people with different mental conditions, authorities can hardly control everything. But I think the best thing to do is to create a society where people have access to opportunities to help when they are.
No, excuse me. Essentially, what I meant was, Cao Can, very much like how China controlled the spillover of the financial crisis 4 years ago. The Chinese government is in most likelihood going to rule by decree. Everything is governed by decree. That's radically different from what happened in the Capitol Hill, right? Countless congressional hearings would take place before a decision is made. I mean, and then during this run-up to the final decision, many more innocent lives would have been lost, right? So what do you think of the differences between the two, decision-making processes and mechanisms?
I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of value in the democratic system because you get to hear a lot of different views and a lot of different perspectives. However, like you said, there is some sort of a delay in action. But I think in the long run, it's better to hear all these different sides to the story before you make a decision than to just quickly, like, let's say after Connecticut, let's say we just banned all weapons immediately.
You mean you would rather run the risk of losing more young lives before,
I didn't
correct
say that.
answer can be acquired, before social justice can be made sure?
I
mean,
think
that's ridiculous for most of the Chinese here.
Let me ask a question for you, Sultan. What can you speak again? What would be do you think that a new law would be passed immediately after a similar occurrence happening in China?
Well, it depends on what kind of law, what kind of decree.
What kind of decree do you think?
I know that politicians want to solve problems by passing some law or decree, but the question is, would that decree or would that law be effective in dealing with the problem?
My question.
I don't know what is the
best. My question for you is, what do you think China would do?
I don't know what is the best way to tackle these shooting incidents, but I do know that just passing a law banning the use of gun would not get down to the root cause of the problem. Because, like I suggested, what would be the logical conclusions if such a law is passed?
First of all, let me tell you, Alexander, there is an absolute unconditional ban on the possession by individuals of weaponry in China here. Before we draw the conclusion, let me ask you yet another very big challenge for President Obama in the next 4 years, the issue of immigration. Do you think he's going to tighten this? Well, to answer this question, during his previous trip to China, President Obama promised to send 100,000 American students to China, and 4 years on, nothing happened. At the same time, more and more Chinese students set their eyes on American colleges and universities. Despite all the discussions about trust and distrust, the soft power of individual cultures, or so on and so forth, what do you think should be done to balance the flow of human resources, or just let it happen?
Well, I think the best way is to correct this misconception about Chinese universities. I think there's a lag between the reality and perception. The prevailing wisdom is that the American universities are much superior to Chinese universities. So no wonder both American students and Chinese students want to study in the U.S.
But you studied in the U.S.
Right, I bought into that that misconception.
You are the beneficiary of American education.
So today,
aren't you?
Would I what?
Are you the beneficiary of American education?
I would hardly say that because, well, my English improved while I was studying there. But in terms of the subject matters like economics, I didn't really learn much.
So you think that the Chinese university is more substantial?
But there's no
education?
In my case, there's no counterfactual because I can't imagine what would happen to me had I stayed in China.
I don't want to do the boring calculation about the statistics. Let's look at the deep-rooted reasons behind the deficit in terms of flow of human resources across the border of nation states. Let's look at the trust deficit. Now, we got the strong feeling that American lawmakers, most American citizens, don't bother to get information about China. Instead, they would easily turn to the television, newspapers, and the media for their perceptions about and the judgment about what China is really about. Do you think this approach threatens to derail real things, real judgment and perceptions?
Right. I think that most Americans are raised, especially of our generation, when we were in grade school, we were raised with the idea that America was or is at essentially the center of the earth,
the universe,
of the earth,
and that's how we looked at ourselves 2 centuries ago.
Right, and this is something that's finally changing.
So you have replaced the Chinese empire with yet another so-called benevolent empire. So is that your argument?
Is that
basically
your... One sec. This is an idea that I think is finally changing, and I think it's going to take a little bit more time to realize. But I think that, especially in my university, more and more students are coming to China to learn about the amazing things.
But I think the younger generation of Americans would have to adjust their perception of their country in the coming decades because we're living in an increasingly polar wall.
I completely agree with you.
Like,
that's a perfect explanation.
right after the Second World War, American is the unquestionably dominant power. The whole system, Bretton Woods, IMF, World Bank, everything's created by the U.S.
Ryan, are you proud of being a superpower?
I don't know exactly how to answer that, but
you don't want to be replaced by an emerging major power, do you?
I think that's the natural tendency of any nation, that they're not going to want to be replaced. But I think that the world isn't like that anymore. That's not us versus them anymore. I think that we need to think about more global cooperation and more global interdependency rather than an adversarial system like that.
But what about the pivot to Asia, which threatens to surround China with a coalition, the Cold War type coalition, alliance? Then China feels threatened. And then if you take China, if you take China as a friend, China is likely to become a friend. If you take China as an enemy, China is likely to become an enemy. That's the very first question that I asked when I first took over this program back in 1999. If you take China as a friend, it will become your friend. If you take it as an enemy, it will be your enemy.
Perception is the reality.
Exactly, and as a Chinese American, I completely feel like America could take more steps towards viewing China as more of a friend. But I think that right now, this region of the world, with the occurrences of the regime change in North Korea, there are so many different things that America likes to get their hands on, and to sort of, it's the nature of how our country functions. That they need to take a closer eye on this region. I hope it is not hostile.
What about the military-industrial complex, a lobby group, very powerful to seek maximum profits at the cost of thousands of lives? Look at the invasions, the wars the U.S. launched.
But I think
since
the
end of
whole,
Second
the
World
whole
War.
military-industrial complex would have to be dismantled in the next several decades, because the whole empire, military empire, was built on the financial strength of the United States. If the dollar loses its status, if the United States have to cut the spending, they have to get down to the military budget. And when that happens, they don't have enough financial power to finance all the wars in
I'm
Afghanistan.
afraid the consensus
and Iraq.
here in China is that the U.S. would never ever let the dollar collapse. They would do that by, for example, introducing another round of quantitative easing, QE4, right? At the cost of inflating our assets in the U.S. I mean, that's selfish, right? From the Chinese perspective, Ryan, what do you think?
I guess I can agree with that.
You agree?
I think we both agree.
Yeah.
I think that, this is how Rome fell. They tried to get their military power into too many places. They couldn't finance it, and it collapsed. And I truly hope that America can see that and start to realize that maybe the direction that we're heading down is not the right way.
Exactly.
All right, thank you very much, gentlemen. With that, we come to the end of this very interesting discussion. Our answers might not be correct, but these are the true points of view from the young elite from both countries. I'm Yang Rui. See you next time. Bye for now.
Guangzhou to Beijing high-speed railway makes it much easier for farmers to become migrant workers, because it's easier for them to travel to cities. And this is also part of the urbanization process. The Chinese leadership wants to transform the Chinese economy from a agricultural economy to a industrial economy. They want farmers to move into the top-tier cities and to contribute to the construction boom there. So even though they may lose their jobs as farmers, but they can get more jobs as migrant workers.
At least 1 decade ago, one senior diplomat from a democracy told me, and her remarks did surprise me. She said, Yang Rui, don't learn from the Israeli or Indian democracy, because the partisan politics mean they argue, they debate endlessly, on and on, without fixing their agenda, without getting things done, as what happened in China. And therefore, I started questioning the virtues of democracy. You can criticize me. You can criticize or balance the views about America being the perfect role model as a super democracy. Now we start from Ryan.
Actually, I don't think the United States is a perfect democracy or a perfect model. As we've seen recently, there's been increased partisan conflict, and it's resulted in some failures to get things done. there's not very much efficiency
But they're
anymore.
pretty
Yes.
bipartisan in spending, right? So their differences are actually minor. There are more similarities between Republicans and Democrats than differences. You know, they all want to grow the government. None of them have the political guts to cut spending. So the differences are actually very minor in terms of their similarities. Do you agree?
I don't really agree that they're that similar. Maybe from someone from the outside or an outside observer, but I think there are a lot of deep.
That the future is very clearly in the hands of the young people.
Is it an attempt to learn more from its strategic competitor? Why does China have far less students from Western countries? Could the sluggish U.S. economy get a lift should Washington amend its 1965 immigration law?
I'm here today because the time has come for common sense, comprehensive immigration reform. The time is now.
And can the structural geopolitical and economic tensions be reduced as young people from both countries learn more about each other through competitions?
Today, we are joined here in the Beijing studio by Mr. Cao Chan, Juris Doctor from UC Berkeley, Mr. Ryan Morgan, undergraduate from Columbia University, and Mr. Alexander Su, undergraduate from Dartmouth College. Welcome to Dialogue, gentlemen. What do we think of the implications of China's success story, quote unquote? I'm Yang Rui. It has long been debated whether trust or distrust between China and the United States is on the rise. Last year brought about important changes to the Sino-American dynamics, most notably the U.S. much heralded pivot to Asia. Now that both countries have completed their respective leadership transition, the two powers can begin redefining their ever-transforming relationship. What will be the major trends in 2013? How do China and America's elite youth view the on and off wrangling in different fields in our bilateral tie?
Information deficit leads to trust deficit. President Obama decides to honor his promise to send 100,000 American students to China.
We focused on student exchanges because we believe.
I think China is very important source of information for the U.S. I think we could learn from China's success. And as I'm a structural engineering major at Columbia, and I've noticed a lot of the infrastructure improvements, and it could definitely be a model for the rest of the world.
Now, when we talk about construction boom, there's yet a quite different story concerning what the success story means about China. The construction boom is actually carried out at the cost of a farmer's well-being. For example, their farming land is shrinking rapidly with the conspiracy between local governments and the property developers. Therefore, they are deprived of their rights to develop their own farming land. What do you think of this accusation?
Well, first of all, the farmers also benefit from the construction boom indirectly. It makes the transportation much easier. You know, in the past, for instance, the